Everyone can see my slides. Thank you so much for welcoming me here and inviting me. This is my first time at ISMB and my first keynote. So I'm really, really excited to be here and excited to open up Bio-Ontologies for you. And as Nuria said, I'm going to be talking about learning from our collective scientific ignorance. How can ontologies help us determine what isn't yet? And I just want to say a little bit more about my background with this question of who am I? I do natural language processing and also think about the philosophy of science. And I try to combine these three things, as you can see in the Venn diagram: mathematics, philosophy, and computational biology. And I really sit in that intersection, trying to think about how we use language to get at our questions and what we don't know. Okay, so to start, I want to take a big step back and ask a big question of what is an ontology. And probably all of you have some definition, but I'm going to take the definition from Building Ontologies with Basic Formal Ontology from Arp, Smith, and Spear in 2015, where they define an ontology as a representational artifact comprising a taxonomy as proper part, whose representations are intended to designate some combination of universals, defined classes, and certain relations between them. Now, I'm highlighting words that I want to make sure we also define. And so I have a few more definitions to go through. A taxonomy, right, is a hierarchy consisting of terms denoting types or universals or classes linked by subtype relations. A representation is an entity, for example, a term, an idea, an image, a label, a description, an essay that refers to some other entity or entities. An entity itself is anything that exists, including objects, processes, qualities, also including representations, models, images, beliefs, utterances, documents, observation. An artifact is something that is deliberately designed, or in certain borderline cases selected, by human beings to address a particular purpose. And putting that all together, a representational artifact is an artifact whose purpose is one of representation. So all the work that we do in ontologies is all about representing reality, representing what's going on in the world. And I want to ask an even further question of what is the purpose of ontologies? Why do we actually create them? Ontology is concerned with representing the results of science at the level of general theory, the generalizations and laws of science, not of particular facts. More precisely, it is directed at encoding certain sorts of information about the general features of things in reality, rather than information about particular individuals, times, or places. So now we're really thinking about the results of science, right? We're trying to encode the results of science, which all of you probably do in your work with ontologies. When we think about results of science, we tend to think about knowledge. Even the cozy definition says we're caring about biomedical knowledge. And so we focus on this knowledge piece. But I'm going to argue for you for the rest of this talk that the other results of science are actually also questions. That every single talk I've heard so far at this conference, they'll give you a bunch of knowledge, or actually they'll start with a question that they're trying to answer. They'll give you a bunch of knowledge, and then they'll tell you the new questions they're asking. And so let's ask a big question. Let's go back to this idea of science and think about what is science itself. And I actually asked this question when I started my PhD because I didn't really know what it meant to get a PhD and what to do. And so when I asked this, the first thing I turned to was the scientific method. This is the figure from Wikipedia. We've all learned this probably in 5th grade or somewhere in elementary school, and probably know a little bit more now that we're all scientists. But just to remind you, we start with an observation or question at the top here. You research that topic, you come up with a hypothesis, you test it with some experiments, you analyze your data, and you report out conclusions, and you continue around this cycle, right? Ideally, this reporting conclusions, which we tend to think of as presenting presentations or publishing papers, leads us back to new questions that we can ask. And I want to highlight for you that everything actually begins with a question, right? That's where we really have to start. And so what I realized is to get a PhD, what I needed to do is come up with a question and then ask it and answer it to some extent. But I didn't know how to do that. So that actually became my thesis for my dissertation. So how do we know what to study and what questions to ask and what answers to find? And you notice throughout this talk, I'll ask a lot of different questions. I love questions, so happy to answer anything afterward. And so how do we do this? We start with getting educated, right? All of us are in graduate school or have finished graduate school. We get some experience doing the research. We get curious and start asking questions. We discuss with our mentors and peers. And then the biggest one that everyone told me at the time and still now is to go read, right? Go look to the literature to find some questions. And then I'll also say you can also find a lot of knowledge there too. And so that's what I did. And so let's look at what a question in literature actually looks like. So this is from a paper here from a PubMed Central Open paper at the bottom there, where it says discussion. We review relevant literature suggesting in utero inflammation can lead to preterm labor while insufficient development of the gut-blood-brain barriers could permit exposure to potential neurotoxins. Now, you can probably all see that there's something going on here, that there's missing knowledge in different ways, or a question that comes out of this. And as ontologists, the first thing you would try to do is add ontology terms, right? Help us figure out what's going on underneath this. So here I'm highlighting for you preterm, blood, brain, and gut. I'm sure there are other ontologies in here, but I'm using specific ones, so I can deal with that later. And so ontologies can really help us identify that knowledge subject of this statement. But I want to go back to the question, right? So that's actually my goal. And so I'm going to add epistemology. And epistemology is a study of how do we know what we know, and that can help us understand the questions that we're asking. So here in green, I'm highlighting for you different lexical cues or words that signify that some knowledge is missing or incomplete. So I have relevant, I have suggesting, can, lead, while, insufficient, could, potential. And that leads us to a knowledge goal, or a next actionable step we can potentially take, or a hypothesis, where it seems like neuroinflammation can lead to preterm labor, potentially leading to insufficient gut-blood-brain barrier development, potentially leading to fetal neurotoxins, right? So now I'm making it really obvious for you what is the question from this statement, instead of just showing you a statement. And actually, this goes a little bit further, where I can actually connect the immune system, thinking about inflammation, and brain development for the fetus. And this is actually a really hard question to study. When it comes to pregnancy, it's really, really difficult for ethical and legal considerations. And so our hope in doing this work and making it really obvious some of the questions is that ideally, if we can find questions in a difficult field to study, maybe it can lead to some answers looking at in other fields. So we took from the immune system and we went to brain development. Maybe we can look to neuroscience for some answers. And prenatal nutrition, or pregnancy itself, is a really difficult field to study. And here I'm just showing you some of that complexity for one micronutrient of vitamin D. And I don't expect you to read this. What I want you to see is there's a bunch of environmental factors, there's a bunch of functions that vitamin D have, and those have many outcomes both on the baby and the mother, depending on what pathway you're taking. And in orange, I'm highlighting for you the two that we've talked about so far: the immune system, immunomodulatory role, and the neurological and cognitive control, the brain. Okay. And our goal is going to be now to capture and represent and explore our scientific ignorance, or our known unknowns, these questions. So I'm going to give you a bunch of definitions to be really clear about what I'm talking about. An ignorance statement is a statement that signifies knowledge is missing or incomplete, which implies a knowledge goal. So here is an example where it says much remains unknown about MERS-CoV and MERS, right? The remains unknown is very obviously telling us something is missing. So those are my lexical cues that are identifying that something is missing. Now, I also want to do this knowledge goal idea, where it's the goal is the next step to address the missing or incomplete knowledge. And this is going to be our formal representation, where here, if something is completely unknown, I just want to explore it to some extent. I don't necessarily care what, but I need to know any information about it. So here we're going to explore MERS-CoV and MERS. And then what all the ontologists would add for me is the biomedical knowledge that is missing or incomplete. Here would be MERS-CoV and MERS, thinking about the coronavirus infectious disease ontology. And to explore it, I'm going to think about two different methods here, where I'm going to think about information extraction to grab all ignorance statements related to an input topic, and ignorance enrichment, where I'm going to think about concepts enriched in ignorance statements compared to all sentences for a given input topic, similar to a concept enrichment that you would do using ontologies itself. And in general, I just want you to see that really we need to actually combine these knowledge and questions to actually get at what we're doing. So I'm both using ontologies and this idea of questions as well. And so with that, both knowledge bases and question bases, knowledge goal bases, or ignorance bases can really help us with that scientific method, going back to that. And so here I'm showing you how that fits in, where your observation or question is really a knowledge goal. What do I want to do with this work? And same with your hypothesis. That's my knowledge goal. And then similarly, for the knowledge context itself, I'm thinking about researching the topic area and analyzing the data, such as a functional enrichment analysis or other things we tend to do with ontologies. But I want to actually add another piece here. This is what I added, where we can actually analyze our data not just in the knowledge context, but also in our knowledge goal context. Because in general, we need to continue around this cycle. And so how do we get there? We get there by thinking about what next questions we can ask. So I can actually help automate that process by doing this not just in the knowledge context, but also in this knowledge goal context is going to be my goal. So let's actually see what that looks like for an example. Okay, so the paper I'm going to focus on is this transcriptome analysis of early pregnancy vitamin D status and spontaneous preterm birth. We worked in a prenatal nutrition context to show feasibility for this, so all of it will be in that context. And this statement at the top is their first objective statement of what the paper is trying to do, right? We ask a question, we answer it to some extent in a paper, and then we transform that question and ask new questions in our future work, right? Is kind of the idea. So their first objective of this paper is to investigate early pregnancy gene expression signatures associated with both vitamin D insufficiency and spontaneous preterm birth, or SPTB, right? So their goal is to investigate the associations between vitamin D and spontaneous preterm birth. And we can show this around the scientific method itself. So their observation, their question is, what's the relationship between vitamin D and spontaneous preterm birth? They researched it. They came up with a bunch of literature that said there is an association there. They did it in PubMed, and they can do it in other spaces as well. They came up with a hypothesis. The underlying goal of an association is, what's that mechanism? That's going to be their goal to figure out. What's the mechanism that's going on here? What plays a role in this? They do a gene analysis to test this, and then they come up with 43 genes as part of their functional enrichment analysis using the gene ontology. And what they find is that the immune system is what seems to be modulating this relationship, as you can see here. And what do? They publish that, right? So that's now their result that they publish out. And in this, they both publish it and then also say, here's other questions that we could ask based on it, as most people do. And what I'm going to show you is, if we add this knowledge goal context, I can both find questions in the immune system and also find questions in the brain, as I showed you earlier. And so that's going to be the result we're really looking for using these methodologies of the ignorance base. And we all know that many knowledge bases exist out there, and these really can help us automate finding the most pertinent knowledge. Here's just a list of a few of them. I'm sure all of you have them in your heads of which one you like to use. And there was no ignorance-based, question-based, or any way that I could actually do this at the time. And so I chose to create that as my dissertation because I wanted to know what are the questions that I could really study. And so that's what I did for my dissertation. And there are many applications of an ignorance base. And I'm going to focus on the two in the highlights. But the first one is this idea of information extraction, where I can find the most pertinent questions to an input topic. The second one is this idea of ignorance enrichment, where I can contextualize experimental results in the questions or knowledge goals. So not just doing it in the knowledge, but doing it in that question space as well. You can also think about this as prioritizing questions to fund for funders, deciding on a journal conference topic, depending on what questions are coming out. And then there's many, many other application areas that you could think of this in clinical spaces, education, communication, investment, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. But what I want to highlight for you is that my actual goal with all of this, or what has become my goal over time, is to think about accessible, transparent, and efficient science. That in general, by making the questions obvious to people, it now allows everyone to see what are we really working on. And all of you, I think, work in this space of ontologies where you're really defining what's going on in reality for other people. So let's dive a little bit deeper into this ontology and epistemology connection, thinking about what and how we know information. So we all know that many ontologies exist to capture what we know, right? All of you could think of your favorite ontology, I am sure. I'm showing you 10 of them here. These are the 10 that I used for my work that was based off of the CRAFT corpus, which is the Colorado Richly Annotated Full Text Corpus that came out of Larry Hunter's lab, where I did my PhD. And they have 97 semantically annotated articles to these 10 ontologies, right? Chemicals, cells, genes, molecular processes, taxa, proteins, sequences, anatomy, parts. And here, just these 10 ontologies comprise 1.5 million concepts, right? There's a lot that we say we know in all of this, which is great. But there's many, many, many more. And I want to take a little bit time to talk about what is an epistemology, right? So we all know what an ontology is, but let's talk about an epistemology. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy that investigates the nature, scope, and limits of knowledge. It examines questions related to belief, truth, justification, and the nature of knowing itself. When you inquire, you can inquire about how knowledge is acquired, evaluated, structured. Topics include the distinction between justified belief and opinion, the nature of evidence, the criteria for true knowledge. It delves into the foundations of knowledge, challenging assumptions about certainty, and exploring the methods and processes by which individuals and societies come to understand and interpret the world around them. So really the central question of epistemology is, how do we know what we know, right? Whereas for ontology, it's what exists currently, or what do we know? And epistemology has many different branches underneath it that different people have studied, especially in the natural language processing space. And they've called it many different phenomena. So we have hedging, uncertainty, speculation, factuality, meta-knowledge, and all of these have very specific definitions depending on what space you're sitting in. But I want to really focus in on this ontologies and epistemology idea. And so I want to focus in on evidence. And there are certain ontologies that actually already exist that really try to get at this. The first one is SEPIO. It's the Scientific Evidence and Provenance Ontology from Brush et al. In 2016, where they're trying to understand scientific claims, thinking about evidence and provenance for scientific information, for scientific claims. It talks about the relationships between claims, their lines of evidence, and the data items that comprise the evidence, the metadata. It's for data integration, curation, knowledge discovery, and evaluation of scientific claims. Another one is ECO, or Evidence and Conclusion Ontology. Its terms or classes that describe types of evidence and assertion methods. It's used again in the process of biocuration to capture the evidence that supports biological assertions. So you'll say an assertion and say it's by evidence Z. It allows tracking, annotation provenance, establishment of quality control measures, and you can query the evidence actually as well. And the last one for ontology specifically are the Ontology for Biomedical Investigations, or OBI, where it's to communicate clearly about scientific investigations by defining more than 2,500 terms for assays, devices, objectives, and more. And it covers all phases of investigation processes, including planning, execution, reporting. So you can say, this is my result, and because of this experiment that I did, right, is the idea. There aren't just ontologies, there's also many taxonomies. I'm just showing you them for uncertainty specifically, but there's taxonomies for all the different topics of epistemology that I had shared. We have it for linguistic uncertainty and clinical natural language processing. This one here is for decision makers like lawyers, also for ecology and conservation biology, and for healthcare. So these taxonomies exist in many different spaces. Everyone is dealing with uncertainty. These are questions that everyone is asking and thinking about. And then just to show you what a taxonomy can look like, this is from a book by Michael Smithson, Ignorance and Uncertainty, Emerging Paradigms, where he showed this ignorance taxonomy that I'm gonna play on a little bit as well. And I wanna just state that all of these works up until this point have focused on the phenomenon, whatever they wanna call it, hedging, uncertainty, other things, in relation to the knowledge. So how hedged, how certain, how speculative, how factual, how meta is the knowledge. And their importance, and with the importance of finding pertinent questions or goals for scientific knowledge, there's a need to actually go a step further and categorize these statements based on their entailed goal for scientific knowledge or their next actionable step. So I want to use these in terms of their actual idea for questions, not just thinking about how do we add a signifier to knowledge is the idea. And so to do that, I built an ignorance base. And 3 different works really underlie all of this. And if you've noticed, I've been using these same colors throughout this whole work, where green is the ignorance statement. Pink are my biomedical ontology concepts or my biomedical knowledge. And yellow is my ignorance-based knowledge goal idea. So if you'd like to learn more, feel free to read the papers as well. Okay. So to build this ignorance base, we started with the literature, PubMed Central Open Access. Again, we're focusing on prenatal nutrition as a focus case study. And part of why we also like it, separate from separate from the idea of it's difficult to study, is it's also a global health problem. And so it's really, it's a diverse problem. You have lots of articles from lots of different places and lots of different study types as well. And it's really important because of that too. And we gathered articles from 1939 to 2018. We started with all our articles. We split them up into articles, and then we parsed them into sentences. Now, the next question is that we want to figure out is actually annotating these ignorance statements, right, and knowledge goals. And so we conducted an annotation test, but before I did this, I first went into the literature and just started reading sentences. And I went through and thought about how do we talk about what we don't know is really what I was thinking about. And I came up with a list of ways that we did that, lexical cues, as well as took all the lists from the previous works I talked about. And we realized pretty quickly as we started this annotation task that it was really difficult to just look at blank statements and figure this out. And so what we did is we took those list of cues that we found and we highlighted them for our annotators. So this is that first step where we actually pre-processed our documents for our annotators to these lexical cues. Then they had to annotate the documents, where what they had to do is say, is this cue an ignorance statement? Identify an ignorance statement or not. We calculated our inter-annotator agreement, or IAA. We adjudicated any disagreements, and then we updated our guidelines of taxonomy as we went through. And so what this looks like, this is that same sentence from that objective of the paper, where here you can see highlighted to investigate and associate. And to investigate mapped the category of an answered research question with this idea of what is the objective that you're stating? And then the goal is to say, did they actually answer and do that objective, right? Because we've all read papers where that has not necessarily happened. And then associated would be the other one, where this is an indefinite relationship, where we really want to understand the mechanism underneath all of this. That's really the goal here. And so if these cues would have been highlighted, and if they were not signifying a statement of ignorance, then they would be deleted based on the annotators. And then the other piece we asked them for was to highlight the sentence, the scope of these cues. And we did it on the sentence level in this case. Okay, so underneath that, we created this ignorance taxonomy, both ingesting all of our previous work that had happened around these similar ideas and through this annotation task. And we categorized this by these types of knowledge goals, that next actionable step. We came up with 5 broad categories, as you can see in the green, with 13 narrow categories underneath that. And then at the bottom, you can see the knowledge goals that come out of that. And I'm going to go a little bit more specific, but I want to highlight for you this one here, epistemic indication of research topic, assertion, or variables, where there's kind of a waterfall of evidence for a claim, where it starts with an unknown or novel research topic or assertion and goes all the way down to largely understood research topic or assertion. So this idea that we'll say something is completely unknown, and then we'll say, well, this is most likely the case, or this is probably the case, and there's a waterfall within that. Okay, I want to go a little bit deeper into some of these ignorance categories. I already a little bit talked about indication of answered research question, where it's a statement of a goal or objective of a study that is attempted or completed by the study. And just to ensure that this is true, we really wanted to make sure we could find the answers in the article or determine if the question is or fully answered in the article itself. Yeah. Another one that I want to highlight is indication of explicit research inquiry. There are times where somebody will actually just state, here is my question. So it's an explicit statement of an inquiry with a question mark or a question word, such as how, where, what, why. And here your knowledge goal is to answer the question, right? Pretty simple there. Or discover methodologies that will help answer that question. I'm showing you also example cues and then the total number that we found for these categories. This is at the top here, indication of indefinite relationship among research variables. That's that association. So a statement about a connection, link, or association between at least 2 variables, connectedness between entities and or interactions representing their relatedness or influence. And here your goal now is to confirm that connection and ideally determine that full underlying relationship between the variables. One of my favorites is indication of anomalous or curious research finding, where this is a statement of a surprising result, conclusion, observation, or situation. The researchers were not expecting the result, but are intrigued by it. And so here your knowledge goal is really to explore that result, determine if the result is repeatable as well, right? So maybe you don't think it's actually true, you want to make sure it's good. And actually, and I'll come back to this, I think in general, this is how we continue science. Whatever is interesting to us or surprising to us tends to be the next questions we like to ask and explore. Another one of my favorite categories is indication of difficult research task here at the top, where it's a statement of something not easily done, accomplished, comprehended, or solved, or a complicated thing with a multitude of underlying pieces or parts, heterogeneity, and then it excludes medical complications. And here, the goal is to create methods to study the complicated system and to better understand any piece of the complicated system, and potentially requires new experiments or better techniques. Here, I think you tend to need an innovation in the field. When somebody says something is really, really hard, there needs to be something new that's going to occur that allows you to get over that barrier. And I think that's very cool. And then, of course, we also have many future work statements as well, where this is an indication of important consideration for future research work. All of you have probably seen these in papers and have called them out. And that's sometimes when your professor says, go read, that's a lot of times where they say to go to the conclusion section, read the future work. That could be now your project, right? So that one you guys all know. Okay. actually this one, that was not this one, that was this one. This one is actually a different one, sorry. This is an important consideration for future research work. This is an urgent call to action. So specifically in global health with prenatal nutrition, there are times where a statement is calling for attention, including an action needed to be taken immediately or information that needs to be disseminated. So they found something really interesting about insufficiency for vitamin D, let's say, and they really need to get that out to all pregnant women immediately. And so I wanted to include that category to be able to take that urgent step and distribute the knowledge ASAP, depending on what it is. Okay, so that is our taxonomy. We conducted the annotation task, and we found that our robust annotation guidelines yielded a high-quality corpus. We conducted 4 annotation tasks of 91 articles total. Here are all my annotators that I'm really, really thankful for. And we calculated an overall inter-annotator agreement of about over 80% for both the lexical cues and the scope being the sentences. And then we're going to automate this, so we split this into training and testing. And I just want to show you in general how these cues bucket out. That our lexical cues employ a really rich vocabulary of how we talk about what we don't know. We found 2,500 cues, both combining the annotation work that we did and previous work, and they all map to different categories, as you can see here, with our biggest category being incompletely understood. And this is just your blanket statement of this work suggests X, right? Run-of-the-mill evidence. On top of that, if you look into all these sentences, the scientific literature is rich in statements of ignorance. Here I'm showing you the number of total annotations and then the total number of unique, right? We say the same words over and over again. I'm sure all of you have your favorite word that you like to use for all of this work, for talking about your questions and what you don't know. And so you can see we say the same words a lot, right, in a lot of these spaces. So that's the blue underneath. And 3 ones I want to call out is that in general, the most that we talk about are indefinite relationships with associations. We also talk a lot about this incompletely understood, saying this work suggests X. And then another one that we talk about the least about is explicit inquiries, where we actually state our questions full out. And so a lot of this is really, really implicit, which makes this task really difficult. And we found that we had 20,000 lexical cue annotations, or nearly that, to 1,202 unique words. So we didn't cover all of our 2,500, but we covered almost half of them, which I think is pretty great. And then we had 6,700 sentence annotations for ignorance. With all that work, we're going to go back to the ignorance space a little bit now and think about how we can continue working on that. So our goal, right, was to take a sentence and then think about, is it ignorance or not, now that I've given you that information. And so in yellow, we're adding all of that in, right? And our goal here now was to identify, categorize, and classify our statements of ignorance using that knowledge goal. So we have 3 different levels of classifiers that we created. One was to the sentence. Is a sentence itself ignorance or not? Next would be that ignorance category or knowledge goal, and to which one it is, which is the 13. And it can be one multi-classifier to all 13 categories, or multiple binary classifiers is how we also did it. And then specifically, we can also think about the lexical cues on that level, where we can think about just, is there a lexical cue binarily? And then which category lexical cue does it specifically map to? And here, that's what we're adding down here, where we add our lexical cues, the ignorance category, or broad ignorance categories, and that sits in the ignorance taxonomy. And we can do this. Statements of ignorance can be automatically identified using Bio-BERT and BERT, large language models, and ANNs. Here I'm showing you those 3 types where we have just a binary classifier for all sentences, and we can do quite well. We also did an ensemble of binary classifiers to each class. It's really hard actually to do one multi-classifier because one sentence can have multiple categories, right? We have multiple cues in different sentences, and making this hard. So you can see that on the multi-classifier level, we don't do as well on the sentence, but everything else actually is above 0.8 and even closer to 0.9. And then on lexical cues, we can actually even do this better. So exact same table, just with the lexical cue level. And here again, we're using Bio-BERT and then also CRFs to do this work. And this multi-classifier is much easier to do on the word level because there's not that interaction in the same way. Okay, so now we have that ignorance side. And the piece that we're missing, if you remember, is my pink, my biomedical concepts. So here we need to do biomedical concept recognition to be able to connect the sentences to the ontologies is going to be our goal. So our goal is to automatically identify biomedical concepts from those 10 ontologies I showed you before. Again, it's over 1.5 million concepts, which makes automation really, really difficult here. And I don't really have time to go into this, but happy to answer questions. As part of my dissertation work, I also worked on the task of concept recognition. And at the time, we had state-of-the-art results, and we used machine translation, actually, a very different idea of how to do this work. And so I'm just showing you our top results for those things. At the time, there was a shared task, and so we're comparing to the competitor of that shared task for this. So here you can see in bold the top scores that we're really matching up with our competitor. And for some, we do better, and for some, we're very close. The one I'm highlighting down here is Pro. The protein ontology is really hard, as probably some of you know, to do. And so we did not do super well on that one. And then I'm also highlighting for you the CRF, a conditional random field. A CRF is a much smaller algorithm than large language models and could perform actually quite as well. And so we wanted to highlight that it's also important to find lower resource algorithms to do this work, not just because not everyone has access to supercomputers or other things to be able to do this work. So we also showed that as well. Okay, so now that's the ignorance base, right? Combining these ontologies and my ignorance taxonomy and putting that all together. And so now our goal is going to be to explore the ignorance base by topic, where we can look for pertinent questions, this idea of information extraction, and by experimental results with the gene list, thinking about this ignorance enrichment idea. And so let's go back to our scientific method with this paper. Because they took a gene list, right, did an analysis, came out, and we're going to do the exact same thing, but instead of doing it in the knowledge context, we're going to do it in this knowledge goal context and come back out with the immune system and the brain as new questions that can be asked based on this work. And so thinking about the methodologies of how we're going to compare this, we're going to look at ignorance enrichment, which again is this idea of enrichment in ignorant statements compared to the top, just to all sentences, as compared to just a normal standard enrichment method that you would do. And if neither of them are significant, it's most likely not significant, right? Whatever topic we come out with, not necessarily helpful. If it's just significant in the standard enrichment, it's probably established information, right? We know a lot of information about it. If it's significant in both, that probably means it's being currently studied. So that's kind of like the immune system, where we have some questions, some knowledge. And if it's just enriched in ignorance, then it's most likely actually an emerging topic. It is only existing in the questions. There's not a lot of knowledge with it yet. And that's really what we're looking for. So what we're looking for are emerging topics that we can find to add to continue around the scientific method cycle to ask new questions. And we're also looking for currently studied, right? Both of those are the two categories we are looking for. And so to do this work, we actually needed to combine our ignorance and knowledge, as I had said a while ago. And so here I'm using Tiffany Callahan's phenylator, her graph of semantically integrating a lot of different ontologies, as you can see here. And they're integrated using the relations ontology, as you can see in green. So in orange are the different ontologies she uses. I did not use all of her ontologies, and she didn't use some of mine. And then the green are the relations ontologies of how you get between them. And these are for phenotypes. Her work is for a totally different thing as well. But I got to use her knowledge base, which was great. We come into this knowledge base with a gene list. We connect that gene list to the genomic part of the sequence ontology and to the protein ontology. And then using the relations ontology, we can connect it to all the other ontologies and basically create a query into my ignorance-based side to figure out what sentences we need and if they're ignorance or not. So that's how this is going to work. We're going to come up with gene ontology, gather a list of ontology terms, find sentences that have them, and then go through the ignorance enrichment process. And we're going to use that list of 43 genes. That's the list we are using. And so if you compare these, we're going to compare an ignorance analysis versus a functional enrichment analysis using specifically the gene ontology. We used David Bioinformatics Resources for this. If you just do your classic enrichment analysis, you come out with a number of genes, and then we also have our ignorance go enrichment analysis here. And we found that two concepts overlapped, which may seem really, really small. Those two concepts specifically were immune system related. So immune response and innate immune response were our two concepts there. In parentheses, I'm showing you the total concepts that overlapped. These are just the ones that were enriched specifically. And then you can look to the David side for established information. So here we have very specific entities, such as specific granule, secretory vesicle. And then we can look to the ignorance side only to figure out what could be emerging topics. So here, female pregnancy, biological regulation, metabolic processes. These are much more systems and broad categories here. And we're going to continue diving into this. If we look specifically at the ignorance side, the ignorance enrichment can help us find emerging topics that implies a field to potentially find answers for. So if you go beyond just Go and look at our 10 ontologies, we had 130 concepts enriched. We found a bunch of immune system ones, right, as you can see here, and the number is just the order of enrichment scores. But we also found many more brain-related concepts, right, as you can see here, brain development, cognition, nervous system, neuron, learning, synapse, many concepts related to brain. And now what we can see is we can maybe go to neuroscience and see if we can answer some of these questions. And with a prenatal nutrition specialist, we actually went through some of these sentences. So here are some sentences from 5 different articles about brain and preterm birth that were not cited in the original paper, right? So we have a comparison paper, which is really nice. And I don't expect you to read these, but you can just see all the pink and all the green highlights of all the different concepts. And I want to pull back out this sentence that we talked about in the beginning of a question. And using all of this, I can actually now fully connect this sentence with this idea of low vitamin D seems to be causing this in utero inflammation, right? Continue through that waterfall of that may cause preterm labor, that may cause insufficient gut blood-brain barrier, potentially leading to these neurotoxins for fetus, which then perfectly relates to this idea of poor brain development if you go through all these sentences. And we continue to ask many more questions, right, with this prenatal nutrition specialist, where we thought about what's the association between development of that gut blood-brain barrier and whole body inflammation and neuroinflammation in the context of the fetal demand. How do these 43 genes relate to offspring brain development? Are any of them specifically related to the offspring brain function itself? What are the effects of vitamin D on life course brain development generally, and so on? And this paper that we pulled this gene list from had no mention of brain at all, right? And now we can come up with so many more questions just jumping off of it to be able to talk about it. And so just in summary of the work that I have shown you so far, is we started with the literature of PMCOA, specifically with prenatal nutrition articles in this case. We, underneath with the ignorance taxonomy, we created ignorance classifiers to classify ignorance statements or not. We also did concept recognition to add those ontology terms. We created our ignorance base that gathered 183,000 ignorance statements. We actually gathered more lexical cues just in this work. So our work did not just stick to the 2,500 cues. We found about 5,000 more ways to talk about what you don't know. And in exploring them, they're very interesting. And then we also had 20,000 biomedical concepts underneath this that was mapped to as well. Using all of that, we explored it. I showed you the bottom one, where we explored it by experimental results with a gene list for vitamin D and spontaneous preterm birth, came out with the immune system as a currently studied topic and brain development as an emerging topic. And here what we really did was we contextualized the experiment results in the questions. And this first one is kind of a similar idea. You can enter this ignorance base in any way that you would like using ontology concepts. So the other way that we did this was we explored it just by vitamin D itself and came out with similar things, immune system and brain. And the other added one we found was respiratory development. So this, in general, can help researchers find the most pertinent questions. And this could have led to many more dissertations if I had wanted it to, which was exactly kind of my goal. And so I'll just state a few limitations. Our goal in general was to show feasibility of these methods and the value of an ignorance base. In general, any automation is adding error. So we all know classifiers are not perfect. And so our ignorance classifiers have some error, and our biomedical concept recognizers have error. The corpus we used to train these was on mice literature specifically, so that could also be part of the error. We also don't fully know the generalizability of our conclusions. We only use PubMed Central Open Access and specifically these 1,600 articles. And on top of that, we've all read not a great paper. And so I'm really trusting the literature here to say that these are the questions that we have right now. And then the last bigger one is this idea of generalizing it to other fields. We specifically focus on prenatal nutrition, but as I stated earlier, I believe these methods could be used anywhere, and prenatal nutrition is actually a really great space to do a lot of this work because of the diversity of it around different countries, around different study types. It's a really hard problem. There's some questions answered and some not. It's a really nice space in that way. And I just want to talk a little bit bigger for a minute more. Our ultimate goal, as I had stated, is thinking about accessible, transparent, and efficient science. And so there's many other things that you could do with this work. I would love to create an ignorance base over all of the literature, maybe just PubMed Central Open Access to start. I think I would love to really connect these ignorance bases and knowledge bases much more, to think about the difference between open and closed questions. Have these questions been answered? Have they not? And I think potentially that's where you guys could help me do that. And then in general, I think there's lots of tools that need to be created for different types of people. So I think there could be tools for educators to teach the history of knowledge through questions and foster curiosity. You have the time of when these questions existed, so sorting them over time is really simple. Tools for researchers, other ways to explore the ignorance space and visualize and summarize findings. That's a space that definitely needs a lot of work. Tools for science communication. We can help create news stories and provide more context to different news stories. Ignorance bases for investing and market research. What ideas and products, kind of the questions, to invest in or answers to pursue. Something I was thinking about, because the hard part is what data would you use? If people have seen Shark Tank, the show where they give an idea and then the sharks or the funders kind of ask them a bunch of questions about it and choose to fund them or not. I think it would be an interesting space to start with that. You can think about a chatbot built on an ignorance base to help researchers generate and refine novel questions and ideas. And then I think there's lots of ethical questions you also need to ask about this work of, in general, who is really asking all of these questions anyways. And then I want to take a second before I finish to go back to this question of what is science, right? So if you remember, I really started with the scientific method, and I was focusing really on this top piece. But recently I presented in a postdoc symposium, and I asked a room full of about 50 postdocs, does anyone actually do this? I guess maybe I'll ask you here. Do you feel like this is what you do every day as a scientist? Okay, so same exact reaction. No one raised their hand. It's the first time I'd asked it, and I wasn't sure. And so I've been actually thinking a lot about the scientific method at large, and my frustration that this is not really what we do. It's really helpful for me to introduce the work. Everyone knows it. So when I presented my thesis, my parents were in the room. They could totally relate to this, which was great. But I actually think there's a totally different way that we do science. So what I've been working on more recently is a new scientific method framework, thinking about it as a knowledge creation framework. And again, my goal, right, accessible, transparent, and efficient science. So the big thing that actually one of that method is missing is impact. We are all asked all the time the so what of what you are doing, right? And it is nowhere on the scientific method. So I think that really needs to be at the top, that's the first thing you're really caring about is what is the impact you want to have with your work, or the so what. Another one that it's missing is people. We're all people, and we all have contexts that we work in, both the researchers and the stakeholders for your work. And that context includes funding, motivation, institution, identities that really inform what questions you're going to be able to ask. This gets at the ethics of questions a little bit more. And then the other one I want to talk about a little bit is this iterative process. We see that it's a cycle, right? It goes round and round and round, but it's not obvious how you actually do that at all. And so this inner loop is kind of the original scientific method, where you start with a question. I'm adding a knowledge goal because that's the language I speak with my work. You have some approach to how you do it that may not just be an experiment. We all do lots of different things. I think also I wanted to call out evaluation. It's really important. How do you know that you've successfully done what you wanted to do? And then you come out with research products. So they say you publish, or they say, what do they specifically say? They say report conclusions, which I take to mean publish or kind of present at a scientific conference. But we all know there's many other things that come out of this, right? GitHub pages, many conversations, new questions, lots of other things. And then, as I said earlier, one of my favorite categories is anomalous, curious finding, when people say surprising results. Because I really think what's interesting to you or surprising to you is what leads you to that next question that you're going to ask. And this is really that discovery loop, right? Discovering new ideas or new products. The other loop that we added is this idea of application, applying it and communicating it out. And really, that's actually how you get back up to the impact. Larry, my advisor, has a great line for all NIH grants start with a death sentence, okay? How many people die from whatever disease you choose to study? Okay, that's like the classic line that Larry loves to say. And I like it too. I've been saying it a lot more. And my question for all of you is, do you actually get back to that? Do you change that number, right? If that's the impact you're stating you're going to have, do you actually do that, right? And I think for some of us, we definitely do. But for some of us, maybe we really just stay in this discovery loop and we keep the same impact over and over and over again, but we're not really applying it out to do something for that impact. And so we wanted to make that really, really clear. That's also important that you really apply the work out and communicate it out. And in general, I'll just state that I think if you really nail down your impact, your question, your evaluation, I think everything else will be pretty simple after that point. And if you know what you're trying to do, what you're trying to ask, and how you know if you did it, I think generally the rest of it can fall into place. But this is all new work and not published, so definitely still iterating on it. I would love to hear your thoughts on it if you agree. Do people think they do this a little bit more? I see some nods, some thumbs up. Okay, great. And with that, I just want to acknowledge a lot of people. There's a lot of people that has gone into this work, especially my annotators, my funding, my thesis committee, many students, my labs, and then a bunch of other people that I've met over the last year or so in my postdoc and then moving with to USC. And so I'll leave you with many quotes and questions about ignorance. My email is at the bottom. At the end of the day, one of my goals is to create an ignorance institute. A lot of people tell me they don't like the word ignorance. I love the word because I think it makes you think, because people think it has a negative connotation. And I like the phrase ignorance is bliss, because when you don't know something, that's your opportunity to learn. And so I think it really is bliss in terms of how I think about the world. And I'll leave you with two questions because I love questions. How does your work fit into the scientific method at large? Is a question I think you should think about. And how does your work contribute to accessible, transparent, and efficient science to help us rebuild the trust in science in general? That's been lacking recently. Thank you.
Hi, this is like a real breath of fresh air. So I was wondering, do you see at some point, because the way that you cast ignorance vis-a-vis knowledge is almost like a dichotomy, but do you think that it's really underneath more of a continuum that's going to sort of so you'll have like a KI database or an IK database rather than two separate things?
Yeah.
And the other thing is, you talked about ontology and epistemology, but implicitly you're moving into axiology and ethics and all that. So, do you think that's the missing sort of thing that, it's like the elephant in the room, so to speak? We talk about sustainability and everything, but to what extent is it an organizing principle for all the things that you do? We do that, goes back to the impact on top that you presented.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the questions. The first one, I agree with you, completely a continuum. It is not a dichotomy. I don't think knowledge is the opposite of ignorance and vice versa at all. It's just a really easy dichotomy to think about in terms of, especially this group and just in general, a lot of people know knowledge bases, so it's an easy one to think about. But it's definitely more of a continuum, and where that continuum even switches between the two is really complicated. These are just really theories of knowledge at large, which is, I love philosophy, so that's where I love thinking. And then your question about axiology and all these other pieces, I think there's so many things that need to be added together to be able to do this work. That what do we state as what we know, right? On some level, if I was a brain in a vat, right, the biggest one I think about philosophically is I think, therefore I am, right, Descartes. And even if I was a brain in a vat, I don't know that I would care because I'm enjoying life. And so sometimes I don't need to go that deep into it. I think what we have and what we're trying to represent with ontologies is sufficient. And I like that really the goal is to say, okay, here's what we think we know, and I want to jump on top of that. And so I do really think we need to put all of this together to be able to succeed. My idea was that so many people have been focusing on the knowledge side, and I just felt that I love knowledge and I love knowing things, but what really drives me forward are the questions I get to ask. And I think all of us in the room could state your questions in 5 seconds. My new job is working with team science. How do we help people collaborate better? And the thing I've been doing with them is if everyone just tells me your questions, immediately you all have something to talk about and you're all really excited by it. Versus if I ask you, what do you know, right? What do you do? That's a way less inviting question, and it feels much more static and hard to have those conversations. And so I really just use this question angle as a way to really communicate with people and focus on what is science really, but it needs all of these different ologies to help me get there. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So thank you very much for the very interesting talk.
Thanks.
I have kind of 2 related questions.
Yeah.
So my first question is, did you evaluate how the statements of ignorance relate to empirical evidence, so data that we have about these statements? Because I find that statements like interestingly and so on, they are very overused in different papers, because what people call interestingly in their discussion section or wherever is quite often not really interesting at all.
You don't even think to them?
Sorry?
You don't even think it's interesting to them? They not be to you.
I think not even to the authors in many cases.
Okay.
It's just a didactic device or so, something some people use. So this is my first question. Do you have any relation to data and see how these statements relate to data. And then my second question is maybe more philosophical, but related to this. Because in science, in empirical science, I wonder if we ever actually know things in the absolute sense, because the whole principle of empirical science is that we do not know things in an absolute sense. We just have stronger and stronger evidence by experiments and by data that we collect for certain statements. So we never really know things in a logical sense. We just have more and more evidence. And I wonder how this fits in your framework.
Yes, two really excellent questions. Thank you. The first one I struggle with all the time, right? People use certain words because we're just told to do it. So the first paper I ever wrote, I remember going into Larry's office and him telling me, this is too factual. Like, why did you, like, no, you can't say it that strongly. And I was like, but it is, right? Like, that's what I found. And so I had to learn to use these statements. And my work 100% contributes to this problem, right? To be super clear that if you added my work to this, it would be problematic too in that same way. It's really hard to tease out the difference of that situation, right? Of what questions are really real and what questions aren't. And it kind of gets to this idea of open versus closed is what you're getting at when it comes to evidence. Have we actually resolved this question or have we not? And that's partially why I added this answered research question, because we've all, as I said, we've all read papers where they don't really actually answer the question they state, or it changes to some extent. We have not connected it to evidence. That's where I would love knowledge base help to do to some extent. And I don't even think it's necessarily just knowledge bases, but I think it's this idea of just databases at large of evidence. And so that definitely is an obvious next step. How you do that is not simple, and I don't have exact answers of the best way to do it. But I would love to really, in general, think about this question of, is it open or is it closed? Or what stage of evidence is it at to some extent? In terms of your second question, part of why I brought this up is this here. This is kind of my waterfall of evidence to some extent, right? Of unknown or novel, we have an explicit question. So when something's just unknown, you don't even necessarily know how to ask a question about it yet. You just say, okay, I have a topic. Then you say, okay, well, maybe I have an explicit question, explicit research inquiry. Then I can say, okay, well, this is proposed and completely understood, right? I have some evidence of something. And then you say, well, maybe there's actually a relationship here, right? An association, whatever type of thing, some link. And then you can say, well, actually, most likely it's the case. I've gathered enough evidence to say most likely. That jump from that to fact, I don't know what happens there, right? And you could, I know people have tried to trace this to some extent of when do you lose a citation, right? Maybe that's it, when we just state a statement and we no longer have a citation for it. I can see your face. I don't know the right answer to this question either. But this idea that I agree with you that it's a waterfall of evidence, and ideally these evidence comes from lots of different angles to really get you to that fact. And at large, I don't know that there is truth or not, right? Like that's a whole nother philosophical question at large. And yet we kind of know what we know and we state we know what we know, right? And that is the study of ontology, right? What do we know? And then really it's epistemology of how do we know what we know and the questions we ask. And so another big reason I love working with questions is that there isn't really a right answer. What is a good question? Or what even should be that adjective before question? I don't actually know. And I've been thinking about this a lot because I want to be able to evaluate this work, right? If I'm thinking about for myself, what's the evaluation of this work? I need to know what that adjective is and I need to know how to measure it to some extent. And I don't even have a good answer for that. And so if I can't even do it in the question space, the question is how do I do it in the knowledge space? Those go both sides. Yeah, that's what I will say. Yeah. Hello.
Thank you for that. You've opened up a lot of interesting questions, which I think is the exact point of it.
Yeah.
I go back to the beginning where you're looking for a PhD topic.
Yeah.
And the question is, okay, you have a point of ignorance. How do you know that it's relatively interesting, valuable, worthwhile doing? And the second thing for a PhD is how do you know you're going to find an answer in 3 years?
Yeah. So your first question is to make sure it was about how do you know it's worthwhile, right? And then the second one was how do you know you can find an answer? So this exactly gets at the conversation I was just saying, right, about what should be that adjective. So you're adding now worthwhile question to ask. Another reason I really love questions is that my entire idea is to spark ideas for other people. So I'm not saying whatever I give you out of this ignorant space is exactly the question you should ask, right? We've all read papers, and on some level there's theories also that people don't write the questions they're currently working on because they want to publish it, right? And what they may write are things that are really, really hard that no one would ever, they think no one could do, actually. And so, okay, so then what do you do with your future work now in that paper? And I don't have a great answer to that. And nothing I read gave me this exact idea, right? Just explicitly. All of this is implicit anyways. But what I love is that's the whole point of it. And so to me, I like actually that there's no metrics. When it comes to natural language processing and we say, okay, it's 90%, like the F1 is 90% or whatever it is, it's 100% correct or all these things. Whenever we find an error, we don't really like it, right? Errors really tell us we shouldn't be using this system. But what is an error in this case? I love that that's an open question because it means you're willing to look at it and spark ideas from it. So I don't know what's a worthwhile question for a PhD student. To me, that's part of the work of being a PhD, to figure out what is worthwhile to you. And then this question of, can you answer it, right? How do you know if you can answer it? I don't even know if I've answered the question I was set out to do, right? I came up with some questions that I could ask for a PhD, but I then didn't go do the PhD, right? I already now got one, which is great. And so I think both of those are really up to the user. There's a lot of user input that has to happen here, whether it's worthwhile or whatever adjective you choose to use. And can you actually answer it? And this is, I think, where Robert Horndorf's question about can you connect this to evidence would be super helpful. Right, that really we need all of this to exist together, not just alone, as also your question asked, to really see this full ecosystem of our collective scientific ignorance connected to our knowledge as well. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Hi. So thank you for the great talk. I wanted to ask how this relates to literature-based discovery. Because in the process of literature-based discovery, we're making predictions about the next research questions to ask, right? And one of the strategies that people have used in literature-based discovery is empirical. So we essentially do time slicing, right? We look back, we model the knowledge that has been inferred, and we make predictions about what knowledge is going to come back and come next, and then we measure precision recall in that space. So I'm wondering if you can actually approach the sort of evolution of this ignorance base empirically using that kind of methodology.
Yeah, thank you for the question. When I started this work, I did look a lot at literature-based discovery in a similar way because they're trying to predict exactly the same thing. I wanted to think about the question slightly differently, right? When I was really told what to do or how to come up with a thesis question, it really was about going to read. And so I wanted to use the literature itself to help me get there and use what people have done, right? We say all the questions people have asked are super useful and really some of it even came from this fact of, I don't even know how to ask a question, right? How do I even just put together a question in the space that I'm sitting in? And so that was really the motivation of how this all happened. But I looked at literature-based discovery of how it predicted, but we decided that wasn't the avenue we were going to go for this work. But I agree with you that it could be a great way to think about it empirically. I think that's a really, really cool idea to think about it. And I love any space that's trying to predict new things. I think is really fascinating. I feel like there's some pushback on it. Well, how did you get there and all this stuff? And what I loved about this is that it's questions that you all asked, right? That was peer reviewed and all these things. So to say that they're not good is hard to say compared to literature-based discovery in some ways. Thank you.
Do I have time for one more question? Since there's nobody behind me, I'm going to take the mic. So another area where obviously a lot of scientific research happens is in the context of randomized controlled trials. And in the medical literature, there's a notion of a PICO question, the population intervention control outcome. And that's the structure of most medical research, right? So in that context, the questions or the new questions that people are asking are often about the eye, right? What's the intervention that's going to lead to a particular outcome in a particular population? And so in that case, the question, the question structure exists. Most of the research around that has a very clear structure. It's really only the question of what are we testing. And so I'm wondering how this fits in that paradigm.
That is really, really interesting. I think in general, part of the point of my work is to really think about the knowledge goal side of it, right? So there, I guess what would you say are the knowledge goals of each of those pieces? Maybe even just intervention. Maybe the knowledge goal is, I guess, how can you give me an example of an intervention question that somebody would ask? Actually, it would be really helpful.
What is the effect of aspirin on hypertension?
Right. So to me, that's a relationship question, right?
Yeah, of course.
And so I guess like that's where it would sit, right? That now it's an association, and my goal is to find the underlying mechanism. So the point of my work is to say, what should I do next, right? So given a statement, what can I do next to get this to work? And so that's where I would say it would fit in. Is depending on how you're asking the question, obviously, what type of question are you asking, and now how can I go study it based on that? So with an association question like that, it's or a relationship, what my question, ideally separate from the intervention, is what's the underlying mechanism of it that I would love to go study.
Yeah, so it might be worth thinking about that kind of
Yeah,
scope,
that's really
because,
interesting.
because medical research, a lot of it is not about mechanism. It's
right,
just
that's
about
valid. That's valid.
direct effect. So
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Thank you.
I have lots of questions I'd like to follow up with you later on.
Yeah, happy to also
But-
chat
but-
offline.
But instead, I'll contribute a topic for future investigation, which is, I think you should look into extracting maximal ignorance out of an article. In other words, the cynic.
The cynic.
You talked about all sorts of ulterior motives for people of why they're really saying that, why they really did this. Yeah,
You're saying extract that.
rip them to shreds. And what is the actual unknown that this paper expresses, as opposed to the ignorance it admits?
Yes, this is a great question. If you have ideas of how to do that, I would love to hear them, because I think getting at that is really hard. Like I could tell you based on just reading papers, because I've now read a lot in this with this lens. Certain ones I definitely notice, but some that would be really hard to really tease apart. So, and I think it depends on the field too of how you talk. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, hello.
Thanks a lot. Very inspiring talk. I was just wondering, how could this work be impacted by the lack of publication of negative results, failed experiments, the sad story of science in a way.
Yeah.
And also, one additional question is, do you have encountered any variability across literature in the way ignorance is expressed in literature, depending on various factors? I don't know, the time of publication, the domain, the discipline, and so on.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I have not specifically, I've looked at it over time, but very base level. It's kind of like the last piece of it of how to summarize and visualize. And I definitely need to do a lot more work of how to really do that. But over time is a really easy one to do, since I know the dates of when these were published. I have not specifically looked at how the language itself has necessarily changed. I've looked at kind of how the categories have come out at different points in different topics, but definitely need to do more with that. So I agree with you on that piece. The second piece, what was the second? You said one other piece, didn't you? Another question. What was the other? Sorry.
First question was about negative.
Negative.
Yeah.
That's what, yeah. Yeah, so something I've actually thought, so the book that really sparked this, and I think I have a quote, I hope, from him. I don't know if I have a quote, but, at the bottom. Stuart Firestein wrote a book in 2012 called Ignorance and How It Drives Science. And that was one of the first books I was handed with my PhD. And it really sparked a lot of things. He was trying to teach a class on neuroscience. He's a neuroscientist. And he studies like the ears of like chameleons or something like that. And he was like, okay, so how do I teach a class to freshmen about neuroscience? And he was like, okay, I could just teach them knowledge, right? But that's not actually what I do. So he totally redid the class and instead had lots of different professors come in and talk about their questions, and kind of similar to what I'm doing now, right? With this idea of like questions really are what drive science. And if you ask a scientist, they'll tell you their questions in 3 seconds, right? What they're really working on and what they're working on now, what they would love to be working on, and all that stuff. And that's really like what keeps us going. He actually wrote a second book called Failures. And in that book, he actually talked a lot about negative results specifically and the importance of it. And so I completely agree with you that I wish we published more. And I know there are some spaces that do. One space that actually does it is randomized controlled trials has negative results, right? You have to publish both. And that's what they say, at least. And so something I've been thinking about actually as another step, I love words that people have negative connotations with. And especially negative is maybe one of them. And so I would love to actually create like a negative base, right, of all the negative results and figure out what can we learn from all the negative results. And the space I think I would start is randomized controlled trials, just because those exist more than other spaces. That's kind of what he talked about. But in general, I wish we had published more. There's definitely biases to what's published. And so at the end of the day, like a big question I always get is how how do you trust the literature, right? How do you know it's good? How do you know all these things? And that's kind of a base assumption I'm making with this work a little bit. But I would love to add more nuance to all of this in the negative way in all the spaces you're saying. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Sure.
So I was just wondering when you mentioned extending this to different kinds of publications and things like this, have you sort of broken down what sections of papers were useful? So I know for some approaches like abstracts are so easy to get, but I don't know if there'd be much in them for this kind of thing.
There's some, not a lot. Yeah, in general, we did break it down by sections to some extent. And surprisingly, so the ones you would expect are the ones that pop out, right? So the intro actually does have some questions because it states the question you're trying to ask, right? That answer research question. And also may state some other questions around that get you at what you're trying to answer. The conclusion and discussion obviously have a lot, right? Because that's where most of us go if we want to find questions at large or new research avenues to go through. And also writing those is thinking about questions, right? When you're writing it too. The results tend to not have a lot because it's very like, here's just what we did. But methods actually have more than you would think because people will say that this is the method we use, but we could have used other things, right? And here's the reasons why. And that's really where some of the unknowns come from. Like what method should you be using in these spaces? So I thought that was a really interesting result that the methods tend to have a little bit more than I would have expected. But really the intro conclusion, those are your big two. Yeah, thank you. And then I do think you need the full paper. The abstract does have some, and like one strategy of an abstract, right? Take a sentence from every like section, right? And so obviously, most likely the conclusion may have an ignorance statement in it, or the intro may, right? If you're stating what you're trying to research, but it's not enough, right? You really want much more. So we really intentionally took the full paper from that perspective. And also like, ideally, I wish all of science was open and I could read all the papers, right? So yeah.
Is there a difference between what we know and what's written in papers? And do you have any ideas about the space, that space?
100%. Papers were just the easiest to take for this task. If I could pick all of your brains and create an ignorance space that really had all of the open questions, because probably you all know them better than like even what you wrote. And I would be interested also to know, like, do you guys feel like the questions you've written in your papers are the questions, right? I don't know if that would be a yes or a no, even for me, right? I don't know if that's a yes or a no, because of how we're supposed to be writing these papers, right? And so, yeah, like I definitely don't think it represents everything. It's also older, right? Automatically literature is behind where we're all working and thinking now. So I think that's the other piece I would add to that too. If you have ideas of how to get it out of your brain, let me know, or better sources. I think really it came down to this idea that everyone was telling me to go read. And I was like, okay, so like I'll read and just do it more automated for myself was really where that started. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for all the questions. I love questions. So I know I didn't give all the answers, but yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Do you have some recommendation how to claim better our ignorance in papers or our research questions?
That's a great question. I would love if we were all just really explicit. So if you notice, like I put a lot of questions on my slides, maybe it's more in the beginning, but I put a lot of questions on my slides because I guess this is a question. Because I think questions really are super inviting to people. And so it immediately gets you thinking about what would be your answer, right? And maybe I don't have the perfect answer, but I'm not giving you an answer because I think even this idea of truth, all of the things we've been talking about, right? What really is that? And what science can mean to one person is very different of what it could mean to somebody else. And so I really love questions. So stating them more, I think would be great. I've already actually influenced my new boss in doing that she's like stating her questions more in her work, which I've found really nice. The other one is I don't love that people hedge. I don't know what the right answer is to that because I know that we need to be clear that we don't fully know information, but we do use a lot of these linguistic features as we've been talking about to say things that maybe are a little stronger or I don't know the right word, but I wish that we were more honest about where we felt like the field was instead of just feeling like we're trying to legally be good, right, and ethically in that way. Yeah, like you're welcome to use my types. You're welcome to like use these things. You can look at the lexical cues I found. Some of them are really fun of how people talk. It definitely has added to my language of how I talk about stuff. And I love in general when people state that they don't know something. So I wish we also talked about more about what we don't know. So that's partially why I love the category of like difficult tasks. When somebody says something's really hard, I feel like it's a really honest and vulnerable thing to say. And you're saying, I'm not going to answer that, right, necessarily, but maybe I'll chip away at it, or we really need this innovation. And I think that space to me is really exciting of there's really a lot of unknown there that you need to figure out. And so I guess I wish we were more honest about what we didn't know too, I would add. Yeah.
And last question.
Yeah.
Do you have an idea or a recommendation of how to make our research questions more findable, accessible, interpretable, and reusable? Maybe using ontologies or your taxonomy or something?
Yeah, that's a really
like
good
ignorance base.
Yeah, like I guess in general, so much of this stuff I feel like is once you get everything connected, that's when things work, right? Literature is hard to search because it's just a lot of text, right? It's not connected. And so I think like what ontologies really help us do is connect all this work together. And so maybe we could do that in a similar way with questions. That was kind of my idea of, let me see if I can pull it up. Of this, right, is like really kind of connecting everything together. That way you could query into it and find all the questions that talk about a specific topic or other things. And the gene list was a whole different thing because I got a lot of ontology turn, you know, as a little bit bigger of a query. But when I did it with vitamin D, right, I got all sentences that had vitamin D in it. And that was a really nice way to just see all of those. You get a lot. And so that's what's really hard, right, of how do you actually now put it together. So I think connecting the dots of all of these would be really nice. But then you still need to figure out how do you visualize and summarize that together, and how do you even rank the questions, right? Like that's also really, really hard. And so a lot of where I feel like I would like to think about in terms of this work specifically is how do you visualize and summarize this, right? Like I don't know the best way to show people questions. And even for you, I feel like all of you guys probably have a lot of discussions about your questions and know them, but do other people know that that's what your question is? Do other people like that? I don't know either. And so I think also my hope is people actually will talk about that more, that like, this is really what scientists care about, right? I care about the questions I'm trying to ask. And I think all of you care about the questions you're trying to ask. The knowledge you find is really exciting. Like, don't get me wrong. But it's exciting for somebody who can go apply it and put it into the world, right? It's not necessarily exciting for you. What's exciting for you about that knowledge is you can ask new questions and keep going with your research, right? And so I just wish we were more honest about that in general. I think that was a big realization for me in the beginning of my PhD of thinking about like, what is science? It's really about asking a question. And so why are we not talking about that much more, right? I wish we were talking about that more too. So maybe it's also a communication style of how we really talk to each other to be able to link it, even if it's just in our brains, maybe not on paper, but to say, okay, like I know Nuria's questions, right? Or I know whoever's questions, and I could state those, and now that's what's in my brain versus this is the knowledge she's talking about. Does that help a little bit, maybe? Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a good question. I love questions, so I generally just collect questions. I may not actually answer them. I apologize. Yeah.
Thank you so much.